Hello, I am making this video for my students who are studying the AQA GCSE Power and Conflict anthology. I'm putting together this video because I want you to be able to have as much opportunity as possible to analyse the poems and to get in depth into their different meanings, as well as the language and structure and form. And this is one of the best ways that I can think to do it, which is just to sit and listen to somebody's opinions and somebody's interpretations of the poems, and just engage with the poems in as much detail as possible. So hopefully when you're listening to this, you're either just soaking up those ideas and enjoying learning a little bit more about the poems, or you've even got a pen and pencil in front of you and you're making some notes or annotating the poems as we go along. I've been teaching war photography this week, so I'm going to talk mostly about war photography, but I'm also going to start making some links to poppies, and we'll look at how those poems compare in terms of their representations of war. The reason why I'll be looking at them quite thematically is because that's exactly what the exam board wants. You will be asked to compare two poems in the exam, so the best way to do that is to start looking at what the similarities and differences are between them right from the start. I'm going to begin by reading the poem out loud, so if you're listening to this or if you're watching this, have the poem in front of you, or just listen to some of those details and start to make your own mind up about what the poet might mean and the kind of feelings and the tone that the speaker is trying to convey. So I'm going to start off by reading War Photographer. In his darkroom he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Nomfay, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. This poem is by a poet called Carol Ann Duffy, and as you'll be able to see, the speaker of the poem isn't the same person as the author. Carol Ann Duffy is pretending to be a war photographer, and her choice of speaker is really, really interesting for us, and that is the kind of thing that you can identify when you're writing about these poems. Don't just leap straight into alliteration and metaphor and simile. Think about the big picture as well. Who is the speaker? Why are they talking to us? And why has the poet chosen that perspective? So when I was talking to my classes today, they made some really great observations about the fact that a war photographer is the kind of person that you don't always think about when we think about war. We think about soldiers and victims, we think about women and children and vulnerable people, and a war photographer is somebody who's very deeply affected by war, but who isn't directly involved in the fighting. The reason why I wanted to compare this poem with Poppies is because both of these poems are from the point of view of these outsider perspectives. You've got a war photographer who might be in a war zone, but isn't a soldier. And then the same in Poppies, you've got a domestic perspective. You've got the perspective of somebody who isn't directly involved in the war itself. And those marginal voices, the use of people who are outsiders as well as insiders when it comes to war, is really, really interesting in terms of the way that they both represent war. Another thing that my students identified straight away was the tone of the poem. So in our classes today, we've talked about the way that this poem communicates the trauma and the horrors of war. So all the way through the poem, we have that feeling that war is powerful, that war is a very dark force. And then as we unpick some of the poem, we get to understand that the writer's attitude towards conflict a little bit more. So what I'll do is I'll talk through the events in the poem, like who is the war photographer, where is he, and the events. So what happens in the poem, what is taking place. And that kind of bigger picture when we're reading a poem is really, really important. Sometimes we can leap straight into quotations without taking into account what the whole poem means. So we'll look at that first and look at the way that Carol Ann Duffy uses the 4 stanzas to take us through almost like a 4-stage journey. So in the first stanza, the war photographer is in a dark room. And a dark room is really, really important for old-fashioned photography. So it's where you develop the photographs in chemicals, and the light, so the red light that softly glows, is needed to help develop those photographs. It's very different to digital photography that we have today. So he's in the dark room, and we have that phrase, finally alone. We get a sense that he's really relieved, or that that he's been waiting for this moment. He's finally alone. So he wants to have some peace and quiet, perhaps. He wants to take himself away from the action. And as he's in his dark room, we are kind of taken through his thoughts. And that's quite interesting because we're in the speaker's thoughts, but the poet hasn't chosen to use the first person pronoun I. The poet has chosen to use the third person pronoun he. And that is really interesting for us because we need to think about the effect of that. For me, my interpretation is that that third person pronoun gives us a sense of detachment. So rather than having that sense of identity, that sense of like, I think this, I'm feeling this, maybe the war photographer doesn't even know how he feels. He's so traumatized that he's kind of lost, and we just kind of see these little fragmented thoughts. And I think that's very clever from Carol Ann Duffy because it makes us feel that sense of detachment and desensitization that the poem is about. So he's in his dark room, and we can see the spools of suffering. The spools of suffering are these film reels where you'd, in old-fashioned photography again, you'd have photographs stored on these kind of tiny bits of plastic called film. And so the spools of suffering represent the photographs kind of spilling across his desk. But then we also have that word ordered rows. So spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. It seems quite methodical and perhaps quite clinical, which is interesting that suffering is laid out in ordered rows. Perhaps there's a sense of kind of juxtaposition there. The only light is red and softly glows, and we've got that colour connotation, the symbolic significance of red, which you should be confident in pulling apart and identifying and saying the poet is using colour imagery here to suggest that. Okay, so you can go into depth and look at the significance of that red and why it softly glows, looking at that adverb softly, and thinking about the atmosphere in that dark room. Another question for us as well is maybe whether dark room has 2 meanings. Perhaps by dark room it means the physical room where he's developing the photographs, but maybe there's another space in which he's feeling isolated and where he feels darkness. And if we'll come back to that later in the poem, I want you to think about what that dark room might also represent. He's in his dark room, and then we start kind of getting all of these little fractured thoughts and images. So the first thought and image is the comparison between developing photographs and this kind of religious ritual. So it says, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. So what we need to think about is the effect of that simile that the photographer is a priest, and thinking perhaps a little bit contextually about religion and war and religion in our society today. Why would the war photographer represent religion, and thinking about why the poet wants us to make that link. We then have this listing of places: Belfast, Beirut, and once again it gives us that sense of the fractured thoughts, the broken thoughts of the war photographer, and it begins to give us a little bit of a picture as to how these memories are constantly intruding into his thoughts. All of these places, you can see them in front of him. And then that really interesting line at the end: all flesh is grass. And I had a really interesting thought from one of my students today where they kind of said, well, that's interesting because it suggests that the bodies are lying on the ground and he's taking photographs of them, and that's really harrowing. Just kind of taking pictures of people who've died because of war. But what was more interesting was the way that they looked at all flesh is grass and how blunt that sentence is, and how mundane grass is. Rather than talking about those horrors in lots of graphic detail, it uses a very, very simple but very mundane word to convey that horror. All flesh is grass. So in our head, we're suddenly thinking about perhaps even as graphic as decomposing bodies on the ground and how terrible it would be to witness that. But the concise, blunt words, this flesh, how important is flesh to us? We know how vital our bodies are, and then comparing it to a completely inanimate object, grass. I say completely inanimate. I think some of my students were saying that maybe, if the bodies are decomposing, they're going into the ground and then they kind of have this second life as grass. I think here, if we think about the tone and the atmosphere of the poem, we're meant to feel quite kind of sombre about that idea that all flesh is grass. It's quite a macabre line of the poem. And then we shift into the second stanza. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands. So it's as though he's kind of shaking himself out of those introspective thoughts, and there's a sense of purpose, a job to do. And the solution slops in the trays, and it says this: they did not tremble, but they seem to now. So why might his hands be trembling? Think about the impact that war has on lots of people, particularly soldiers and post-traumatic disorder. Are his hands trembling because of fear, because of the memories, because he's upset? The way that it's phrased, though, they did not tremble then, gives us this nostalgia about the past. He used to be kind of a stable, happy person. They did not tremble. And there's also this sense that the speaker doesn't want to admit, my hands are trembling. So he's using the negative form, they did not tremble. So rather than admitting what's going on, there's maybe a little sense of denial there as well. And in this second stanza, the main shift is that he's kind of trying to come back to the moment. So he was in his dark room, but then he started thinking. He tries to come back to the moment, and he talks about rural England and coming home. But that idyll, that idyllic, ideal image, that rural England, that fractured small sentence in the middle of that line, the caesura that separates it in that line, on the surface that seems so idyllic. We love rural England. It's beautiful, verdant green hills and sunshine and big horizons and blue skies. Actually, that idyll juxtaposes with all of the war zones that he has been to. So it's home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. So it seems kind of so trivial, being home, it's not important compared to everything else that I've seen, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet. And we begin to have some real juxtaposition here between that idyllic rural England and the things that he's seen in war zones. The feet of running children in a nightmare heat and all of the bombs going off underneath them. And so seeing these fields is perhaps triggering memories of actually the horrors that can lie underneath and the terrible things that he's seen. Look at that imagery that's being used to describe the explosions in the war zone. The poet decides to use the example of children. So presumably the war photographer has seen lots of people, but it's talking about children. It's talking about the most innocent people in society, which is interesting for us once again when we start making our links with poppies, because we've got that childlike perspective in poppies as well. Look at the use of emotive verbs, explode, but once again, it's this negative form of the verb, don't explode. So we've got that sense that the speaker is struggling to separate reality and his memories. He's looking at the fields, and rather than just seeing the beauty, he's seeing what isn't there. He's seeing all of the horrors in his mind. And running children. So think about the sense of panic and urgency in that line as well, which is quite clever because you have that moment of horror, and then the poet moves on to the next stanza, and you have this sudden present tense coming into the poem. Something is happening. We're in the third stanza now, and the third stanza is almost like a flashback. So in the first and second stanza, the speaker was trying to be in the present. He's in his dark room, he's got a job to do. But by the time we get to the third stanza, it seems like he's not in control of his memories anymore. The trauma is suddenly really invading into the present. Something is happening. And there's meant to be a real kind of jarring change in the poem. And we sometimes call a shift or a change in the poem a volta. And you normally find voltas in sonnet forms of poems, but I think it's kind of appropriate to call this a volta, a sudden shift in the poem. Something is happening. Caesura, just to keep that little pause, that little break, that moment of emphasis in the poem. Something is happening. Tension at the end of that line. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. And we have all of this distancing vocabulary again. A stranger, something. So it's kind of vague and then twisting and faintly. And this could be seen to have two meanings. Firstly, that he is haunted by these memories, that he's seeing these before his eyes but in his mind. But the other way to read it is that it's actually physically happening. The photographs are developing, and as they develop, the images slowly become darker on the page. A half-formed ghost. So think about the choice of half-formed, that adjective half-formed, and then the noun ghost. It's meant to be haunting and to show us that, to reinforce that theme of death in this poem. Caesura again. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must. So it seems to me there that he's been in a situation before where a woman has been dying and her husband has been there as well. And it seems to me like she's dying, maybe she's just injured, but he wordlessly, he silently seeks approval. So maybe he looks across at him in this moment, and he's wondering if it's morally okay to take a photograph of somebody in danger, and he's worried about like, can you imagine if you're a war photographer and how helpless you are, how powerless you are? Some of my classes today came up with some great ideas about the powerlessness of being a war photographer, and how you're constantly at the mercy of your editor, and you're at the mercy of being in a war zone where you can't actually help people, you can't fight. And in this situation, he wants to take a photograph because he wants to capture that moment and show people what's going on in that war zone. But it's really difficult for him because he seeks approval from the husband. Can you imagine how intimate that relationship is, husband and wife? And you have this outsider, a war photographer, kind of glancing at you, asking, can I take a photograph of your wife? And we're not told the full story. It is all just hinted at. But it says in the last line of the stanza how the blood stained into foreign dust. So rather than saying the woman died, or he took a picture of her lying on the ground, it's just hinting at it. The blood represents the whole woman, presumably, or the dead body, how the blood stained into foreign dust. And that word foreign again, all of this kind of feeling of home and being away. Perhaps there's this kind of theme of belonging and identity in this poem as well, more inner conflict that the war photographer is experiencing. And some of my classes as well identified that the word dust is really interesting. It's got those kind of religious connotations again, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and perhaps the spiritual significance of that word choice there. End of that stanza, on to stanza 4, 100 agonies in black and white from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6. So we've gone from that moment of being in the war to suddenly being in the moment when he's back home and other people are in control of who sees his photographs and which photographs are published. 100 agonies. So once again, rather than saying all the people I photographed who have died, he's saying 100 agonies, which kind of mirrors the language used in stanza 1 where it says spools of suffering. So it's using adjectives, suffering and agonies, it's turning them into nouns, spools of suffering, 100 agonies, and it's reinforcing and exaggerating the feeling of pain and trauma in the poem and the horrors of war. 100 agonies in black and white from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. And I think that's the longest kind of continuous clause, so kind of one sentence uninterrupted in the poem. It goes across 3 lines without any commas, and it gives it this kind of casual tone. 100 agonies in black and white from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. It sounds very everyday, but when we think about it, it's really, really shocking. People are just sat at home reading through newspapers, and these pictures are really ordinary. And it says that it sort of says the reader's eyeballs prick with tears, so perhaps they are a little bit upset, but ultimately it's suggesting that we are desensitized to these images. We see them all the time. They don't affect us in the same way that it affects the people who are in the middle of war. And that feeling of desensitization is really reinforced by the nouns here, the bath and pre-lunch beers. They're just looking at these images, and it's something that they do between these luxuries that they have the privilege to enjoy. They're having a bath, they're having a beer. How much do they really care about these people who are suffering when they are so privileged themselves? And that idea of this poem being an outsider voice, a marginalised voice, is really interesting there, that we're looking at people who are privileged, and the idea that people who are suffering or going through warfare don't get the privileges and the rights that they deserve, and how unfair and immoral that gap between the sort of people who are suffering and the people who are well off is. Final couplet. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So that final line, that all of this is a job. He earns his living by doing this stuff. It makes it sound as though it doesn't matter. But we've just read all of that poem and we know that he really cares and that he's been really deeply affected by it. So we've got this distancing again, this kind of sense that he's trying to control his feelings about war, he's trying to control this trauma, but he is suffering and he's struggling. And that final line, that other people don't care, that other people are privileged and they've not seen the things that he's seen, is really stark and really sort of powerful for us as readers when we finish the poem. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. I think this poem is really important for us when we're looking at representations of war in the GCSE anthology, because it's that outsider perspective, and because it also connects with themes to do with inner conflicts. Because on the one hand, this is a poem about the morbid horrors of war, and on the other hand it's a poem about the photographer kind of struggling with his own profession and struggling with his own traumas and struggling with his own experiences. I'm very quickly just going to look at some of the features of the overall structure of the poem. So obviously it's got the 4 stanzas and that journey from the darkroom to rural England to the war zone to the editor and the readers in each of the 4 stanzas. But we've also got some interesting structural techniques in terms of the poetry and the construction of the poem. So some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves as readers is, why does Caroline Duffy choose to have a regular structure to this poem? So it's very methodically laid out. The number of lines in each stanza is always the same, and let's have a look at the syllables in each line. In his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows. So there's a regular rhythm, round about 10 or 11 syllables per line. I don't think that there's a strong iambic beat, but there is in some lines. If we look at the some of the lines in the final stanza, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. You can hear that regular stressed syllable pattern that we look at, that you may have looked at when you've studied Shakespeare. Between the bath and pre-lunch beers. You can see that there's a regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. But that isn't the case through the whole poem, just in places. So there are some very organised parts of the poem, but some parts where it's kind of breaking that structure. And where it breaks the structure, that's where we need to look at those words and figure out why it's breaking that structure. So to me, in that final stanza, the reason why it has that sudden, like, regular iambic pentameter is to make it sound quite sing-song, kind of trivial, innocent, which is interesting because that's the line which is kind of mocking all of the innocent readers. The readers' eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. It's kind of really mocking the idea that they care. Their tears are meaningless. And that's reinforced once again by the internal rhyme of tears and beers. There is some rhyme throughout the poem, once again a regular structure. So we've got alone, then we've got rose glows. So we've got an A, B, B, he, C, mass and grass. So it's an A, B, B, C, D, D structure, and that's the same all the way through the poem. So if we look at stanza 2, trays, A, then again, B, dispel, C, feet, heat, D, D. So we have 2 pairs of rhyming couplets in each stanza. And it does give it that sense of organisation, perhaps in the same way that he's very methodical and organised with his film reels, spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. Once again, perhaps creating a juxtaposition between the organised kind of, yeah, the kind of like organised, safe surface reality versus the inner turmoil and conflict going on underneath the surface. So there is a sense of organisation on the surface, but maybe everything underneath isn't as it seems, a little bit like it is with the war photographer himself. I asked you earlier just to have a little think about that idea of the darkroom. He is in his darkroom finally alone, and one interpretation for you could be that that darkroom is also meant to represent his mind, which would reinforce some of the other interpretations that we've got, that the darkroom is his mind, and that in this poem we see a lot of his mind. Let's have a quick look at poppies, because I said I'd contrast that in terms of representations of war. Poppies obviously represent remembrance, and the last point that I'm just going to leave this video on is the significance of memory in war photography. I'll do a separate video about poppies once we've been teaching that one in our lessons, But just start thinking, you know, what is the significance of memory? What's the power of memory in war photographer? How does the poet represent the past? And perhaps that can help us start to draw some nice similarities and differences to representations of war in poppies. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully it's been a useful half-hour video for you. Please encourage everybody in year 10 or year 11 who is studying the poetry anthology to watch this and have a pen and paper ready to do lots of annotations on your copy of the poem. Remember, please, that these are just some of my ideas. I've stolen some ideas from my classes, but when we read poetry, there are lots of different interpretations that we could make of a poem. So go out there and speak to people and ask them what their opinions of the poem are, and have a little look on Google as well. There are some good websites where you can revise these poems. So you can have a look on BBC Bitesize, or you might have a little look. I imagine if you just do a quick Google, you'll find loads of stuff. So if you find any resources, let me know. Let me know if this video has been useful to you, and what I'm planning is maybe just put up a couple of videos as I'm teaching to help you and just make up a little bit of extra time, seeming as when we're in lessons we're all so busy working in groups and talking about things, that it's nice just to sit down and listen and think about it for yourselves. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.